it's really actually a very interesting tissue, and here are some fascinating facts about it. Notice that there are some numbers here. I will not ask you any numbers on the test, okay? So all the numbers are just kind of for your own information. You'll see in this chapter they give you a bunch of numbers like normal blood counts, normal blood volume, etc. So those are just, FYI. I'm not going to ask you numbers on the test. But as you guys could probably guess, if you were to just guess, what is the most tested tissue in the body, you know that whenever you go to the doctor, just about every time, whether you're just getting a physical or you're not feeling well, they usually draw blood and look for something. They want to see like the normal blood count, or maybe check some kind of level that, whether you have, they suspect an infection, or are looking for sometimes hormone levels, or you can even check for certain cancers. Different types of cancers will release what they call tumor markers into the blood. So there's so many things that they can check for. Just about everything that affects us, whether it's some kind of disease, infection, whatever, will cause some kind of change in the blood, which is very convenient because it will give doctors clues as to what's going on. So this is the normal blood volume, slightly higher in males than females. Men are usually larger, so they have usually a slightly larger blood volume. It's roughly 8% of your body weight, so if you take 8% of your own weight, that is roughly how much your blood weighs. And notice that the normal temperature of blood is slightly higher than the temperature we test when we take our temperature on the surface of the body. So this is why we talked about how, blood vessels in the skin can help us control body temperature. So notice that because the temperature of blood is a little higher than the temperature on the surface of the body, if our blood vessels supplying the skin dilate, allowing that, more blood to go toward the surface, that heat radiates out away from us. So that helps to cool the body. And this is the normal pH. pH is the acid-base balance. This is, notice, a really narrow range. So if the pH or acid-base balance in the blood changes by very much, it will actually start to destroy our enzymes. And remember, enzymes are necessary for every chemical reaction in the body. So it will, of course, start to make you not feel well, and that's when we feel sick, like when you have, whatever. There's a lot of different diseases that will affect the pH of the blood, and it can be, of course, fatal. So what type of tissue is blood? Which of those 4 categories of tissues is blood in? Epithelial, connective, muscle, or nervous tissue? It's connective, right? It's a connective tissue. So remember, connective tissues are characterized by scattered cells with a bunch of stuff between the cells. So in this case, the stuff between the cells, or matrix, would be the blood plasma. So blood is a connective tissue that has a fluid matrix. Very different from other connective tissues like bone, for instance, which is solid. Okay, so different functions. Of course, blood transports oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, carries wastes away from our cells, also carries things like hormones, which I think I have listed somewhere else, carries antibodies, carries cells of the immune system to areas of infection, so transports a lot of important things to and from our cells. Also, as we said before, it can help to regulate body temperature because blood vessels in the skin will dilate or constrict depending on, the environment around us, or, whether or not you have a fever. Also, the blood has what we call buffers that help to control the acid-base balance of our body fluids. You guys will talk about that when you take physiology. And also, blood actually helps to regulate other body fluids like our interstitial fluid, our cerebrospinal fluid, lymph, which all of those fluids come from the blood. Okay, so stuff that you will talk about a lot when you take physiology. You already know how cerebrospinal fluid comes from the blood, right? In the choroid plexus of each ventricle, right? It's actually a filtrate of the blood. Okay, so we all know that blood looks red, right? And if we were to take the blood and put it into a centrifuge, which would pull the blood cells down toward the bottom of that container of blood, you would see a separation between the blood plasma and all the cells. Now notice that most of this, where the cells are here, still looks red. Why would that be? Because most of the cells are red blood cells, and red blood cells contain a pigment called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is what actually binds to oxygen. So notice that most of our blood cells are red blood cells. There's just a little tiny bit right in here, and so this is hard to see. I'm just going to kind of outline it. This is what is called the buffy coat. And the buffy coat, notice it will kind of, if you, again, put the blood in a centrifuge that pulls the cells down toward the bottom, the buffy coat will end up kind of between the red blood cells and the plasma. And this is our white blood cells and our platelets. Okay, so all of these blood cells are also called the formed elements of blood because they are not all true cells. So these would be the red blood cells, also called erythrocytes, the white blood cells, also called leukocytes, and these are pretty much colorless in the blood. That's why they're called white blood cells. And the little fragments of cells that are called platelets. So all of these together make up the formed elements. So this is really what blood is. It's just the plasma, right? Blood plasma, which is the fluid portion. And again, we said this is, like if we think of this as being a connective tissue, the plasma really is the matrix. It's the intercellular matrix, okay, plus the formed elements. And that's all there is to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what's in blood plasma, and we'll talk about red blood cells some. And so what I'd like you guys to know about all of this is just basically what these different cells look like and what their functions are. So that is what we are going to cover. We're going to focus on what's in the plasma and what the cells look like and what their functions are. So in this chapter, you will see that it covers things like the life cycle of the cells. It tells you how long they're present in the blood, like how long they live, how they're formed. It tells you about the blood types, like the different blood types, whether you're type A, B, AB, or O. It's all interesting. You can read it for your own information. You do not have to know it for the test, okay? So again, what we're going to cover is just what's in the plasma, what the cells look like, and what their functions are. Some of this is going to be part of your extra credit assignment, so I'm going to let you guys cover it, okay? If you decide you're not going to do the extra credit assignment, you're still going to read it on your own, okay? I think you're going to do the extra credit, though. I think you are, because you guys love anatomy, right? Oh, yes. Okay. So, again, going back to this, very interesting that most of our blood cells, again, if you go take a look at all the formed elements or cells, most of them are red blood cells. Red blood cells actually make up 1/3 of all of the cells in the body. It's like a staggering number of red blood cells. So we have roughly 25 trillion red blood cells in the body. Huge number. And that is why blood appears red. Okay. So this is just a table that kind of gives you a little breakdown of all the different parts of the blood. This is what's in the blood plasma. We'll go into this in a little bit more detail in just a minute. It shows you kind of what red blood cells look like. And then this is kind of what platelets look like. These are just drawings, of course. And then notice we have different types of white blood cells. So these, again, are going to give you a lot of numbers for like the normal counts for all of these. And also, this will tell you, you know, of all of the white blood cells, like for instance, the neutrophils make up 60 to 70% of all white blood cells. You don't have to know the exact numbers. This is something that when you guys are working in an office or hospital, wherever you happen to be working, you will have this information. You won't have to memorize all these numbers. It's on the printouts from the lab tests. So, you know, you don't have to memorize all of that. And after a while, you'll start to just know the normal numbers if you look at enough of these. Okay, so this is just, you know, kind of FYI, this is how a blood slide is made. Because we have so many red blood cells, it's called a blood smear because they take a tiny, tiny drop of blood and smear it really thinly across the slide. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to see anything because the red blood cells would just cover the entire slide, it would just fill the entire slide. So this is how a slide is actually made. We will not be making our own slides. So this is just kind of, this is how it's done. Okay, so what is in blood plasma? Well, again, blood carries a bunch of stuff to and from our cells, so it makes sense that blood plasma is going to contain the gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide. I'm just going to use their chemical abbreviations. Also, of course, nutrients like glucose carried in the blood, amino acids. These are the building blocks of our proteins, so these are carried in blood plasma to our cells. Wastes are removed from the cells. These will be eventually broken down by the liver and removed from the blood by the kidneys. These would be things like urea, uric acid that end up in the urine, get removed by the kidneys. We end up excreting them. Hormones, of course, as you guys know, endocrine glands secrete hormones into the blood, so they're carried through the blood to what are called the target cells or target organs that have a receptor for them. Antibodies, very important because this is how we, of course, have immunity. Once we're exposed to a certain pathogen, then white blood cells make antibodies so that when we're exposed to that same pathogen again, we have a quicker response time. And plasma proteins. We're going to talk about the plasma proteins in a little bit more detail, but these are important proteins that are carried through the blood and they have different functions. So like all of our body fluids, blood plasma is mostly water and has over 100 dissolved molecules in it. Okay, makes up roughly 55% of the total blood volume. And they say it's straw colored, just meaning that it's not perfectly clear, but again, it's not red. What makes the blood red is the red blood cells. So we're looking at just blood plasma. It's kind of has a little tinge of color to it. It's not yellowish, but it's not perfectly clear. And going back to, let's see here. Yeah, so you can see here, again, showing the total volume of blood. Plasma is roughly 55% of the total volume. Just so you kind of have a feeling for the different percentages for plasma, red blood cells, and the white blood cells and platelets. Okay, so questions so far? Okay, so let's talk about the plasma proteins. There are 3 groups of plasma proteins, and they are listed here. Okay, so I would like you guys to know what these do. This is just for the written exam. This is not anything you have to identify. Okay, so first of all, albumin. Albumin is the protein that's in the blood in the highest concentration. It's really important because this is what actually helps us to maintain normal blood volume. This is formed in the liver. The liver does like a million different things for us, and one of the really important functions of the liver is that it makes this plasma protein which enters the blood, and because albumin is a large molecule, it has to stay inside the blood vessels, meaning it can't leak out across the walls of our capillaries like smaller molecules do. So it stays in the blood and it creates what we call osmotic pressure. And you'll talk more about this when you take physiology, but this is what helps to maintain normal blood volume. It prevents blood plasma from leaking out into the tissues. So normally, some blood plasma does leak out into the tissue cells, which is good because it carries nutrients and oxygen to the tissues. But albumin helps to control that. So it helps to maintain normal blood volume. In people who have liver disease, because this is one of the functions of the liver, they often do not have a normal level of albumin in their blood, and as a result, blood plasma kind of leaks out into the tissues. They become puffy, kind of swollen, and the blood volume drops as a result. Okay, so another group of blood plasma proteins are globulins. Globulins are divided up into these three groups, alpha, beta, and gamma, named after the Greek letters. Alpha and beta globulins are both formed in the liver. You'll see the liver actually forms most of the plasma proteins, and their function is to bind to lipids and carry lipids through the blood. You guys know lipids are fats, right? So if you've heard of lipoproteins, they are lipid protein molecules, and because lipids do not travel through the blood on their own, they always will hook up with a protein and are carried through the blood to different places. So alpha and beta globulins carry lipids to different areas. Again, also formed in the liver. So I would like you guys to know where these different plasma proteins are formed. Okay, so notice this next group is the only one not formed in the liver. Okay, so gamma globulins. Gamma globulins are also called immunoglobulins. I'm sure you've all heard that term, immuno, as in immune system. So this is another name for gamma globulins. And so if you remember this, that might help you to remember that gamma globulins are actually antibodies. So you can call them immunoglobulins, you can say gamma globulins, you can also call these antibodies. And these are, again, carried through the blood. These are not formed in the liver. They are formed by a type of white blood cell called a B lymphocyte. Okay, B lymphocyte. It's a type of white blood cell. And then the last group of plasma proteins, fibrinogen. Fibrinogen is something that's always present in the blood in its inactive form. This is its inactive form. But when we have a break in a blood vessel, this will be converted into its active form, which is called fibrin. And fibrin is really what forms a blood clot. So the function of fibrinogen is to stop bleeding. It actually forms a blood clot whenever we have a break in a vessel. So I'm sure you've heard of the clotting factors that are present in the blood. The clotting factors are different molecules that are also in an inactive form. But when we have a break in a vessel, there's this series of chemical reactions where all of those different clotting factors are activated. The last step in that whole sequence is where fibrinogen is converted into fibrin. And fibrin forms these long, kind of thread-like structures that will all clump together, forming the blood clot. So this is what actually forms the blood clot. This is the clot itself. And in smaller vessels, this of course will stop the bleeding very effectively. In a really large vessel, it of course would not be enough to stop bleeding, but it can slow the bleeding. And also formed in the liver, so people who have liver disease often do not have normal blood clotting times, so that's one of the tests that doctors can do. They can look at the time that it takes their blood to form a clot. And there's all different kinds of medications for that, of course. But you can see the liver forms a bunch of important plasma proteins. Any questions on any of that? Okay, so let's talk about the formed elements, and we'll start with red blood cells. So you guys know the primary function of the red blood cell is to, you guys all know this, right? Carry oxygen, right? They carry oxygen to our cells. So this is just a table telling you what's carried in the blood plasma. Okay, so one more thing. Before we get to red blood cells, this is a test that's commonly done. There's so many different blood tests, but this is a common blood test that just tells doctor, is the normal, if you have the normal percentage of blood cells in the blood. So that hematocrit, sometimes just called the crit for short, and this is abbreviated HCT. Very common blood test, just tells you the normal percentage, whether or not the normal percentage of blood cells is present. So this is the percentage of the total blood volume that is the actual formed elements or blood cells. And because men have more red blood cells than women, this is gonna be higher in males. This is given as a percentage because it's the percentage of the total volume that is the formed elements. So you don't have to memorize the numbers, but you can see that it's quite a bit higher in males. And notice there's a normal range in both males and females. It doesn't have to be, precise. There's a normal range.
What do they call it, crit?
It's just short for hematocrit. Hemo or hemato refers to the blood. And crit, I'm not sure exactly what, the root of that means. I'm not sure where crit comes from, but crit is just short for hematocrit. Is that what you were asking, is what crit means? Yeah, I'm not sure. I would have to look that up. That's a good question. Okay, so red blood cells, also called erythrocytes. Erythro refers to the color red. Okay, so again, these are by far the most abundant of all of the blood cells. Just to give you kind of a feeling for the number of red blood cells in the blood, the normal count is roughly 5 million per what is called the cubic millimeter, which is written like that. A cubic millimeter of blood, if you can, kind of visualize a millimeter, it's really not even the size of kind of like a drop, what we, imagine like a kind of average size drop. Cubic millimeter is tiny, tiny, tiny amount of blood. And if you can, just imagine 5 million red blood cells in that tiny little amount of blood. So a huge, huge number of red blood cells in the blood. And the function is to carry oxygen. So this is showing the shape of a red blood cell, and you can see that they kind of have this weird shape where it kind of caves in the center. So looking at them from the side, they look kind of like this. This is what's called a biconcave disc shape. And what this does is it helps to bring the cell membrane closer to all of the hemoglobin molecules that are inside. And we'll talk about hemoglobin in just a minute. Another interesting thing about red blood cells is that as they mature, they lose their nucleus and most of their organelles. So that's why they don't last very long in the blood. They can't replace parts of their membrane as the membrane wears out. So they only last for roughly 120 days. Eventually, as they move through the tiny, tiny capillaries, usually in the spleen, they will break open because the membrane just kind of becomes weaker and weaker and weaker over time. And parts of the red blood cell will be recycled and used in new red blood cells. So they end up kind of, as their nucleus and a lot of the organelles just kind of shrivel up and die, they become just kind of bags of hemoglobin. So each red blood cell has roughly 250 million molecules of hemoglobin inside, roughly. So if you do the math, each hemoglobin molecule binds to 4 oxygens. So that means that each red blood cell can carry about 1 billion molecules of oxygen. So they really carry a huge amount of oxygen, huge oxygen carrying capacity. If you look at this from the surface, which is what they're showing here, because the center is thinner, they end up looking kind of like just pink donuts on slides. Okay, so we'll take a look at that a little bit later. And that's just because the edges are actually thicker, so they'll look darker on slides. And something else that's kind of interesting about them, because capillaries, our tiniest blood vessels, are so tiny, red blood cells have to line up single file to go through them. And that single file row of red blood cells is called a rouleau. sure, but I think this might be misspelled. I have a feeling, you guys can check that, or if I remember, I'll check it later. But just FYI, I think it might be misspelled. I'm not sure.
There's no X.
There's no X? Oh, okay. I guess I just liked the way that looked with the X. Okay, so it's pronounced rouleau, but no X. Okay, thank you. Okay, so hemoglobin, this is again, just kind of FYI. I said 250 million, your book says 280 million. Okay, well, close enough. There's a bunch of hemoglobin molecules in there. And this is just, it tells you a little bit about its structure. You don't have to know this for the test, okay? I'm not gonna ask you about the structure of hemoglobin. So this is just kind of, I think it's kind of interesting. Hemoglobin is a protein, and protein molecules are often really large, and they have kind of unusual shapes. So this is just a little bit about the very complex structure of hemoglobin. And you'll see that each one of these globin chains has what's called a heme group, and the heme group has an ion, and the iron is what oxygen binds to. Okay, so you can see that description here. Again, each one of these globin chains has what's called a heme group. Looks like the planet Saturn here in this drawing, and that is what oxygen binds to. So each hemoglobin molecule can bind 4 oxygens. This is really important, of course, for patients who have any kind of condition where their oxygen carrying capacity might be compromised. Really common in patients who are elderly or have any kind of respiratory conditions, have cancers. So common that their oxygen carrying capacity may be compromised. So you guys will always be checking oxygen levels of your patients, and they're always going to be monitored. So you'll talk quite a bit about this in physiology. Okay. And this is just about the kind of life cycle of a red blood cell. You can see that red blood cells are formed in what tissue? Red bone marrow, right. And what is that process called? The formation of red blood cells? Actually, we talked about the formation of all blood cells. What is that term? One of the functions of the skeletal system. You guys know that. Oh my gosh, it was so long ago. Does that look familiar at all? Oh yeah, okay. So hemopoiesis or hematopoiesis, again, hemo refers to the blood. So the process of formation of red blood cells specifically, actually the name is very similar. It is erythropoiesis. Again, erythro refers to the color red. Okay, so this is just formation of red blood cells. And like our other blood cells, they are formed in red bone marrow. This is what they're showing you here. They only last for roughly 120 days. They'll eventually be removed from the blood, mostly by the spleen, but also the liver. So when people have damage to the spleen, like when they're in accidents, sometimes the spleen, it's very vascular, it stores blood. So it usually bleeds quite a bit, and sometimes it's just removed because sometimes it's difficult to stop the bleeding, and the liver will take over the function of removing the old red blood cells from the blood. And then parts of the red blood cell are recycled. So notice that the iron, is what they're showing you here, iron gets recycled. We don't just get rid of it because it's a normal part of the red blood cell. It's what the oxygen actually binds to. This is why it's very common for women to have iron deficiency anemia. There's a bunch of different types of anemia, but iron deficiency anemia is the most common in women because women lose the iron every month. And of course, that iron doesn't get recycled. Okay. And so this is just a little bit about the formation of red blood cells. I just think this is, again, you know, the numbers will not be on the test, but because we have so many red blood cells and they're always being taken out of the circulation as they, you know, kind of wear out, roughly about 3 million per second are released into the blood. It's interesting, I think, because it's a huge number. Okay, so that is it. That's all I'm going to talk to you guys about, because you're going to cover the rest of this.
How long does it take the bone to produce the red blood cells if they're getting released at 3 million per second?
The whole formation, I'm not sure. From the very beginning, from that first stem cell that's in the bone marrow to what's actually released into the blood, I'm not sure. That's a good question. I'd have to look it up. The question was, how long does it take for the formation of the red blood cell? Because there's a lot of different divisions where if you look at, you guys have, and I think I might have it in the PowerPoint toward the end. This is actually a picture of a blood clot taken with an electron microscope. And so you can see the fibrin threads. This is what I was talking about earlier. This is fibrin, and you can see the fibrin threads just kind of all come together in this network, forming the actual clot. And these are blood cells. As the blood kind of passes by the clot, the blood cells get trapped in it, and they make the clot larger. And it helps to kind of pull the sides of the broken vessel together, stopping or at least slowing the flow of the blood. Oh, okay. Well, I guess that picture I was thinking of is not there. So let me just, do you mind if I use this for a second? So I'll show you guys. Okay, so this is the chart that's on page 646. It's figure 2110. So you can take a look at that if you're interested in hemopoiesis. Okay, so you can see that there's, as these cells that are in the bone marrow, as they divide to form blood cells, there's like many divisions. So I don't know how long that process takes, but I would imagine it's you know, not overnight. I think it's going to be somewhat lengthy. That's a good question. Okay, guys, so I want to